So you can get drug-resistant Aspergillus for free in your own garden, or you can buy it commercially.
Absolutely.
Ba-dum-bum. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to People, Parasites, and Plagues, a podcast aimed at delivering information about the fascinating pathogens among us from the scientists who study them. I am Kim Klanowski.
And I am David Peterson, your host for today's episode. Our guest today studies a pathogen that spreads easily, for which there's no vaccine, and is also resistant to most drugs. Will this be the last of us?
Our guest today is Dr. Michelle Momany, professor of the Department of Plant Biology and a member of the Fungal Biology Group. Dr. Momany studies fungal pathogens that cause over 1 million deaths each year worldwide. Michelle, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Good to be here.
So, Michelle, one thing we'd like to ask our guests is about their journey to a career in science. So what's your story?
Oh, I have a very twisting story. I started out actually as a music major. I played cello, and after 3.5 years in music, I realized that my earlier interest in science and doing something a little bit more scientific was important, and so I briefly did a stint in chemical engineering, and then I realized that engineering wasn't quite what I wanted and ultimately landed in microbiology. Did my bachelor's in microbiology, finishing at University of Texas in Austin, postdoctoral work at Purdue in Indiana, and then came to University of Georgia. I started out in microbiology being really interested in sort of how cells take on special roles, so this whole process of differentiation. But I found out pretty early on that I really didn't like doing animal work. And I just happened to have a conversation with another grad student working in a fungal lab. And when I explained, I didn't want to do animal work, but differentiation was really cool, he told me about fungi. And that was sort of where I ended up going after that. It's been they're really interesting organisms to work on because you can do a lot quickly, but I have no guilt when I put them in the autoclave at the end of an experiment.
So, Michelle, do you still play an instrument?
No, my musical stuff now is more dancing. I'm a salsa dancer with a lot of different groups that dance just recreationally in Athens.
Oh, that sounds fun.
Yeah, that sounds really fun. So I understand that you've been studying fungi since you were a graduate student and then, of course, continuing into your postdoc. What was your research focused on then?
So in graduate school, sort of my first real fungal project, I mentioned this interest in differentiation. So I knew I was really interested in cancer biology, immunology, all these roles where you have a cell that doesn't quite know what it wants to be when it grows up, and then it finds its role. And it turned out that the fungal lab in Texas at University of Austin, so this was Paul Sanizolo's lab, was looking at this fungus that was then known as Wengiella dermatitidis. And what Wengiella did is it would grow as a yeast shape, but it would also grow as this really big round body with cross walls called a sclerotic body, or it could grow in the more typical fungal shape, which is a long tubular cell that we call hyphae. And my project was looking at sort of how was the cell wall managed among these different shapes.
That's a lot of different cell shapes for one organism.
Yeah, and we still don't fully understand how these switches happen. There are actually a lot of fungal pathogens in particular that will switch shapes. So they'll grow in a yeast form or a hyphal form. And some of the forms are what you see more often in infection.
So this is our second episode featuring fungal research, but I think it might be good to review exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about fungi and how they're different from other eukaryotic pathogens.
Yeah, so people sometimes are a little confused and amused that I'm in a plant biology department. But if you look historically, fungi didn't get their own kingdom until 1960s. Up until that time, people knew that they sort of didn't move like animals, and sometimes they were green, so we kind of got glommed in with botany. Then it became clear fungi are actually a whole separate kingdom, and the hallmarks of that kingdom Fungi grow by what we call extracellular digestion. So they put enzymes out into the environment and then absorb the nutrients back in. They're also not photosynthetic, so they have to have preformed organic carbon to eat. So we don't really belong with plants.
So, Michelle, when I was preparing for this conversation today, and I was reading up a little bit on fungi, because I don't think about them as often as I probably should. I read something that said that fungi support our world's entire ecological system. And I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, I think really fungi are kind of having a moment. Everything from The Last of Us, which you referenced in your introduction, to, if you're a sci-fi fan like I am, Star Trek Discovery, like the most recent version of Star Trek, has a spore drive with the idea that there's a massive mycelium covering the galaxy, and spores is how you travel quickly in the universe. I should put the disclaimer that is not true. So that one's not true.
That we know of.
Yes, that we know of. So fungi do underlie an awful lot of processes. If you look, most plants that you see have fungi that are associated with the roots and help them to get nutrients from the environment. So they're really critical for most of the plants that animals eat, which underlies, pretty much everything else.
Because I think I'm a gardener, so I'm always thinking about fungi as being helpers and also problems in the garden. So in terms of, you're talking about being associated with their roots, I know that there are certain plant products that are sold to consumers that are said to help your plants get started and they say it's helpful fungi that's going to associate with the roots of your plants.
Yeah, so this whole group of fungi that associates with plant roots are called mycorrhizae. And there is a lot of really fascinating research on sort of how these interactions get going and how it helps the plants. I should also mention, I'm here to talk more about a fungal pathogen of humans, but most fungi are beneficial. It's a very small minority. I think I saw the number 300 species of fungi that can actually cause disease on humans. Where plants are concerned, there are a lot more pathogens of plants that are fungal, and that's part of why we're seeing the problems that I'm looking at in my lab with antifungal resistance. But plants, the latest estimates I've seen, 20% of crops worldwide every year are destroyed by fungal pathogens.
That's a massive number.
Yeah, it's a huge number. And if you think about questions of food security, plant pathogens are super important. So what's happened, I mentioned fungi are different from plants and from animals, where it was separate kingdom. There are a few things that fungi have that plants and animals don't have. And those things end up being good targets for antifungals, whether they're antifungal drugs to combat pathogens of people or antifungal fungicides to combat pathogens of crop plants. And that's where some of the problems coming in.
As a gardener, when I'm outside, and perhaps we have gardener listeners, most of the time when you see anything that's a brown spot on a leaf, people will tell you it's something fungal.
There are an awful lot of fungi that cause brown spots on leaves. There are also, bacteria, viruses that can do the same. But yeah, if you look at most plant pathogen departments academically, they spend a lot of time on fungi because they are a huge problem for crops.
So one thing I find really interesting is you study some fungi that can infect people too. And is this an opportunistic one that would mostly infect someone who's immunocompromised, or can it also have an effect on immunocompetent people?
Yeah, so first, the broader answer. Many fungi that are pathogens of animals are almost solely infecting immunocompromised, or at least much more of a problem with immunocompromised. So this is kind of the broad answer. Our immune systems and also our body temperature have, in many ways, protected animals from fungal attack. With climate change, that's starting to be a bit of a worry. Think about the lead-in on The Last of Us, where they talk about fungi are adapting to warmer and warmer temperatures with climate change. That's actually a real thing. I don't think we're going to be like infected by zombie fungi anytime really soon, but that basic premise is accurate. Anyway, the fungus I work on in particular, Aspergillus fumigatus, it's a saprobe. The estimates are that any one of us probably breathes in 10 to 100 Aspergillus fumigatus spores every day. If we were to take a plate outside right now on the University of Georgia campus, we would probably get some Aspergillus fumigatus colonies there, so it's everywhere. The problem with Aspergillus fumigatus, the spores are really, really small. They're about 2.5 microns. So to put that in context for your listeners who might not think about this size, if you look at like a period on a piece of paper, you could line up 30 spores inside that period before you could see it. So it's really, really small. We see these microscopically. If you have a lot of spores together, though, you'll see sort of a gray-green haze. Anyone who's had moldy bread knows what kind of spores look like, right? But those spores in Aspergillus fumigatus are so small that they're very easily windborne, very easily inhaled, and lodge deep in the lungs.
Oh, because they're so small, they can get down deep.
Yeah, and so what happens with fumigatus, if a host who's susceptible inhales those spores and the immune system doesn't mop them up quickly in the lung, so macrophages and neutrophils usually take care of these very quickly, but if that doesn't happen, those spores are dormant, so they're sort of hibernating until they see carbon. But there's a lot of good carbon source in a lung. So they'll break dormancy if the immune system doesn't take care of them. And then they start to send out these long tubes that I talked about, the hyphae. Those can invade the tissue then in the lung. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the hallmarks of this kingdom is it puts out enzymes that break down whatever it's growing in and eat it. That's what happens in the lung.
So it kind of digests your lung tissue?
Yeah.
And then...
Yep. Anybody who's seen an orange with mold on it is familiar with what this looks like. This is what fungi have evolved to do, to grow into a substrate, break it down, take the nutrients. So if your immune system's in good shape, you're okay. Where there's a lot of problem, though, is we have a lot of people whose immune systems are not in great shape right now. So with what's called invasive aspergillosis, so fumigatus growing into lungs, the latest estimates I've seen is that there are 2.1 million cases annually worldwide, and that's leading to 1.8 million deaths worldwide from this fungus. If you look at invasive fungi more broadly, so there are other fungi that cause damage in this way, it's almost 4 million deaths a year worldwide.
That makes fumigatus alone one of the biggest pathogens in terms of death worldwide.
Yes. And part of what's very difficult, we don't have really good diagnostics. So many times aspergillosis is diagnosed at autopsy, which isn't very useful. There are a very limited number of antifungal drugs that work well, in part because fungi and animals actually shared a common ancestor much more recently than fungi and plants, for example. So there's certain things you can't target in a fungus without really hitting the host hard.
Yesterday I was in class showing a phylogenetic tree of eukaryotes, and there's the metazoa and fungi on the same branch, far away from a lot of the other eukaryotic pathogens. So it makes sense that their potential drug targets are more similar to the human enzyme or whatever it is.
Well, so one of the targets that's really good, because humans don't have it, is a sterol that's in the membrane. So this is part of what makes the membrane fluid, that's called ergosterol. And this is the fungal equivalent of cholesterol in humans. So people don't have it. So it makes a really good thing to target with drugs. And so the drug class that hits this ergosterol is called azoles, azole drugs. With crops that are being hit by fungal pathogens, ergosterol is also a really good target. and there are azole fungicides that are being used. The bit that they're targeting is a protein called CYP51A, and what's happening now is that the use of these agricultural fungicides is leading to resistance. So the agricultural fungicides are not being used against Aspergillus fumigatus. It doesn't attack plants. It's just in the soil, happily eating things that have already died, leaves, that kind of stuff, okay, soil. But it's sprayed on the crop plants. It kills whatever fungus is causing the crop disease. Then it washes into the soil, and the Aspergillus there sees it, becomes resistant in order to survive. Now you have azole-resistant Aspergillus fumigatus, and then if someone inhales it who is susceptible, they now have aspergillosis, which is azole-resistant and much harder to treat.
The fact that this organism is in the soil and we're breathing it in at the numbers that you talked about is really impressive. So it's kind of like swimming in an ocean of sharks, they're everywhere around you. So can we talk a second about people who are immunocompromised? Because we've tossed that word out a few times in our recording. Can we talk about who those people are in a broader sense? So people who were not only receiving treatment for cancer. Can you just...
Yeah, actually with Aspergillus fumigatus in particular, one group that's hit really hard with fumigatus is patients with cystic fibrosis, for example. Patients who have COPD, so any kind of breathing issue. Another really large class of people who are affected by this is people who are undergoing therapy for leukemia. So it turns out a lot of the leukemia treatments that you have to do before a bone marrow transplant knock out neutrophils, which are a critical defense. So there are some cancer hospitals which will give azoles or other antifungals prophylactically before all of the treatments that they have to do to get ready for a bone marrow transplant. You also see a lot of allergic aspergillosis, so this is not necessarily life-threatening. What I was describing, where the fungus breaks dormancy in the lung and invades the tissue, is called invasive aspergillosis, and it's the one where I said there are like 1.8 million deaths worldwide. In the U.S., it looks like there are nearly 9,000 cases a year. If you look, 2018 is the last year we have good numbers for, but about 9,000 cases a year that have been diagnosed in hospital. Okay, so those, the invasive aspergillosis, once that's diagnosed, the death rates are astounding. They're usually like 50% up to 95%, depending on which study you look at. If you have azoles, it takes it down some, but it's still way higher. But if you look at, there's also allergic aspergillosis. A lot of people are thought to suffer with allergic aspergillosis. There's also a chronic aspergillosis, where instead of the fungus invading the lung tissue, it grows as a ball in the lung. It's called a fungus ball or an aspergilloma. And that is a particular problem with people post-TB, tuberculosis. Those cavities are a good site. And so some of the estimates I've seen, they're like high percentages of people post-TB that end up with aspergillomas. So it depends on which, in terms of immunocompromised, this invasive disease, definitely that's much more common in immunocompromised, but there are also the allergic and the chronic that can happen even if you're not immunocompromised, but the immune system is just able to contain it a little more or to overreact to it, depending on which one we're talking about.
How about the effect on people who are, say, in their late 60s? And I'm just asking for a friend.
As you hit on there, being older does compromise the immune system. And so it can make you more susceptible to a variety of fungal infections, including aspergillosis. One of the things people sometimes ask me, if they find out what I do and we're talking about this, is, oh, I have a parent who's undergoing chemotherapy right now. What advice do you have? I think one very simple piece of advice, and if you look on the CDC website on fungal diseases, they give this advice as well, is, don't be in areas where there's a lot of disturbance of the dirt. If you're gardening, if you must garden, be really wary of compost, wear a high-quality N95 mask. You're putting yourself in a position where you can be inhaling a lot of those spores. So some of it's being careful about what kind of environment you're in. The other kind of different point about this, people are used to thinking about especially respiratory diseases as being highly contagious. Aspergillosis you get from the environment. So it's not like it goes patient to patient. So it's really controlling the environment and your inhalation. But as I said, some estimates are everybody is breathing in, 10 to 100 spores a day.
I just find it really fascinating that an organism that lives happily in the soil and is adapted to growing in the soil where it doesn't have to fight an immune system can also infect humans.
Yeah.
Maybe not ones that have a fully functional immune system. So it's an interesting jump.
So one probably really important piece of that puzzle that I left out, Aspergillus fumigatus is extremely thermotolerant for a fungus. It can grow up to 55 degrees Celsius. So for the listeners out there not doing a lot of Celsius, that's over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's part of why it thrives in compost. If you look at studies of what fungi are in compost, fumigatus is usually at the top of the list because the high temperatures in the center of a compost pile don't kill it.
So as someone who was spreading compost a week ago, should I be concerned about sticking my hands in the compost? As someone who, is a normal average gardener.
If your immune system is in good shape, you're probably fine. I should also mention, though, if you suffer from allergies, like almost everybody who's been in Athens, Georgia for any length of time does, if you're on heavy-duty steroids for asthma or allergies, that also compromises your immune system and makes you more susceptible to fungi. So personally, if I'm doing a lot of that kind of thing, I'll put on a mask. This can also get into skin if you've got open cuts and things, but the cutaneous is much less common. What you really, really have to worry about is the inhalation. Can also cause sinus infections, but again, that one's less common and less deadly.
So fumigatus does not actually infect plants, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, but for the varieties of fungus that do infect plants, can any of those also infect people? Or is that just too much to ask? Two
No,
different hosts.
there's actually been some really interesting work on a specific fusarium species that can infect tomato plants and animal hosts. And I've seen some really interesting studies just starting to come out about, what does it do differently in a tomato versus an animal host. Yeah, so there are a few. If you think about what fungi need to thrive, they degrade organic material, they burrow through the material, so they need carbon, and they need, the right temperature, but they really can kind of thrive in a ton of environments. So as a fungal biologist, it's not as surprising to me. Plants and animals are just another substrate to fungi. It's just usually the immune system's doing a good enough job to keep them out.
Yeah, and that's true. And when I teach immunology, we always say it's hard to study fungi in a lot of the models that we work because if you're immunocompetent, you're fine, right? And so you have to disrupt something to study something, which makes it kind of difficult.
So I want to jump back to the use of azoles in agriculture because it kind of reminds me of how antibiotic use in production animals is blamed on the development of resistance pathogens that can directly infect humans. And you have a very similar situation. So are we running out of antifungals?
Yes. And the parallels are even stronger than that. It actually turns out when I first started working in this area with my collaborator, Maren Brewer, Maren is a plant pathologist, fungal expert here at the University of Georgia. The way our collaboration started, I had just heard a lot about azole resistance to fungi that infect people. And one of her graduate students was working on azole resistance and fungi that infect plants. And we started talking about sort of what was in common. Okay, so one of the things Maren realized, we started doing a study that was funded by the CDC to ask the question, how much azole-resistant Aspergillus fumigatus is in agricultural environments in the U.S.? I should probably back up a second there and give you some context. It turns out about 15 years ago, it became clear in Europe that azole resistance was increasing in the clinic and in patients. And in the Netherlands in particular, they saw that this azole resistance was coming from agriculture. So if you think for just a minute about what you would expect to be a big export in the Netherlands, tulips.
And it's the perfect season. It's the perfect time right now here in Athens, Georgia.
Yeah, and it turns out tulips, if you think about how those bulbs are prepared, they're moist. They've got soil on them. It is fungal heaven, right? So the tulips, they put into azoles to soak the bulbs before they ship them. Then they peel off that outer layer like an onion. It goes into the soil. Now you've got lots of azoles in the soil. Aspergillus fumigatus in the soil develops resistance. Susceptible people breathe it in, and now you see a lot more resistant aspergillosis in the clinic. So fast forward 10 years, CDC was starting to see more azole resistance in the U.S., and they got concerned and started a passive surveillance program and found that we were finding azole-resistant fumigatus throughout the country. But no one had looked yet to see how much is in agricultural environments here, sort of where is it coming from. So Maren Brewer and I, our labs, got together, put together some proposals and did some studies showing, first we started just in Georgia and Florida at several different agricultural sites. And short answer, yes, there is a lot of azole-resistant Aspergillus fumigatus, especially if you're looking at the kind of crops like peanuts or cull piles from other crops where like the leaves and branches and things are all put in a pile and kind of allowed to sit there. That turns out to be kind of a hot spot for development of resistance. So then we put in for another study, which is actually in press right now, so it's just about to be published, looking at 8 other states in the U.S., some on the East Coast, so Pennsylvania's in there, things out in that area, and then also California, Oregon. And again, pretty much everywhere we looked, agriculturally, there is azole-resistant fumigatus. What's really interesting, there are some areas where flower bulbs have been planted, tulips in particular, rotated with hemp, and we do see a lot of resistance there to multiple azoles. When you dig down into that and look at the isolates, they're very similar to the ones that they're finding across Europe. So we've got another study that I did in collaboration with Maren's lab that is in second revision now, so it's like this close, at Applied Environmental Microbiology. So this study with Maren's lab, one of Maren's graduate students, Caroline Wong, went out to commercial places and bought compost, soil, flower bulbs, peanuts, all kinds of various products, asking, do we find azole-resistant Aspergillus fumigatus on these products? And yes, we do. So flower bulbs in particular, there was a fair amount of resistant fumigatus compost and soils that you can buy commercially. And this is, I'm not going to name names, but, big box places, DIY places, also had Aspergillus that was resistant to azoles. Things like Peanuts, we didn't find it if they had been cooked, but when you buy like raw peanuts in bulk, you can get some Aspergillus fumigatus that's resistant there too. So again, in terms of anyone who knows they are immunocompromised, don't think just because you're buying the product commercially, it won't have resistant Aspergillus fumigatus in it. You should just take care, wear a mask, that kind of thing if you're disturbing it.
So you can get drug-resistant Aspergillus for free in your own garden, or you can buy it commercially.
Absolutely.
But there's going to be our little opening.
Could be.
Our guest today is Dr. Michelle Momany from the Department of Plant Biology and the Fungal Biology Group. Michelle, thanks for being with us. Links to additional information about Dr. Momany's research can be found on our Instagram account at PPPPodcastUGA.
Thank you for tuning in today. Please rate the podcast, and if you have any questions or suggestions for future episodes, reach out to us via email at ppp@uga.edu. This podcast is brought to you by the Faculty of Infectious Diseases and the Grady College of Journalism at the University of Georgia. It is supported by the University of Georgia through the Office of Research, the UGA Graduate School, and the College of Veterinary Medicine. Thanks to the New Media Institute at Grady for use of their Studio Not Found podcast facilities, and a special thanks to our production assistant, Sid Wigand, for research, editing, scheduling, and keeping us on track.